April 15, 1815. Morning, London. The spring rain beat against the windows of the modest townhouse on Grosvenor Square as Margaret Ashworth stood frozen in her morning room, staring at the package that had just arrived by special messenger. Her hands trembled as she recognized the familiar weight and shape of her own letters, all 47 of them, returned unopened in a neat bundle tied with black ribbon. The blue morning dress she wore, chosen with such care for what she had hoped would be an ordinary day, now felt like mockery against her skin. She had written to him faithfully every week for 2 years since his departure to the peninsula, pouring her heart onto paper in the only way society permitted an unmarried woman to communicate with a gentleman. The Duke of Pembroke had promised to value her correspondence, had looked into her eyes at that last ball before his regiment departed, and assured her that her letters would bring him comfort in the darkness of war. Now those same letters lay before her like accusations, their wax seals unbroken, their contents unread, their very existence apparently unwanted. The butler who had delivered them stood awkwardly by the door, clearly aware of the significance of what he had brought, for servants always knew these things, and by tea-time the entire household would be whispering about poor Miss Ashworth and her foolish hopes. She sank into her writing chair, the very chair where she had penned each letter with such care, choosing her words to bring him news of home, sharing her thoughts on books and music, describing the changing seasons in Hyde Park. Never crossing the line of propriety, but always hoping he might read between the lines to understand the depth of her regard. The rain intensified, matching the storm in her heart as she touched the topmost letter, dated just last week, wherein she had welcomed him home from the war and expressed her joy at news of his safe return to London. How naive she had been, how pathetically hopeful, sitting here in her spinster's domain at 28 years of age, forgotten by society, invisible at every gathering, believing that somehow her words might matter to a duke. The crackling of the fire seemed to mock her as she remembered how she had imagined him reading her letters by candlelight in his tent, perhaps smiling at her descriptions of his sister's wedding or her aunt's latest eccentricity, perhaps even missing the sound of her voice as she missed his. But he had not read them at all, had not even possessed the courtesy to break the seal on a single one, and now they were returned to her like a slap across the face, a clear message that whatever connection she had imagined between them existed only in her foolish spinster's dreams. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Margaret pressed her fingers against her temples, willing the tears not to fall as memories flooded through her like water through a broken dam, carrying her back to that glittering ballroom 2 years ago where everything had begun. Where she had been standing by the wall in her usual place among the potted palms and forgotten debutantes, when the Duke of Pembroke had approached her with those startling grey eyes that seemed to see through all the layers of social pretense to the woman beneath. She had been wearing her best gown, a rose silk that her aunt had declared made her look less sallow, though Margaret knew nothing could make her beautiful enough to catch anyone's notice in a room full of fresh-faced debutantes half her age. Yet somehow he had noticed her, had crossed the entire ballroom with its glittering chandeliers and swirling couples to stand before her and request not just any dance, but the waltz, that most intimate of dances that set tongues wagging when a duke partnered with a forgotten spinster. His hand had been warm and steady at her waist as he led her onto the floor, and she had been acutely aware of every eye in the room upon them, every whispered speculation about why the most eligible bachelor in London would waste his time with Margaret Ashworth, plain Margaret who wrote too much and smiled too little, and had long since been relegated to the shelf of unmarriageable women. But he had not seemed to care about the whispers, had looked only at her as they moved together in perfect time to the music, and when she had stammered something about being honored by his attention, he had smiled, not the polite, social smile she was accustomed to seeing, but something warmer and more genuine, and said that he found her conversation at dinner earlier that week the most intelligent he had encountered all season, that he valued discourse over decoration and wit over wealth. The dance had ended too soon, as all perfect moments do, but before returning her to her place among the wallflowers, he had held her gloved hand a moment longer than propriety dictated, and spoken the words that had changed everything, telling her that he would be departing for the peninsula within the week to rejoin his regiment, but that he would treasure any correspondence she might be kind enough to send, that letters from home meant more to a soldier than she could imagine, and that hers particularly would bring him comfort in the long, dark nights of war. She had believed him then, had seen something in his eyes that looked almost like longing, had felt the pressure of his fingers on hers like a promise, and so she had written, week after week, pouring her heart onto paper in a way she had never dared to speak aloud, and now those letters lay before her like broken promises, like proof that she had been a fool to believe a duke could ever truly value the words of a spinster who had nothing to offer but her heart. The afternoon sun had shifted to cast long shadows through the morning room windows by the time Margaret finally stirred from her chair. The bundle of returned letters still clutched to her chest, like armor against the world that would soon know of her humiliation. For servants talked and news travelled faster through the back stairs than through the front doors of Mayfair's finest houses, and already she could hear the telltale whispers beyond the door where the housemaids were no doubt discussing poor Miss Ashworth and her foolish dreams of correspondence with a duke. Her aunt's voice drifted from the hallway, that distinctive combination of concern and exasperation that Lady Beatrice Ashworth had perfected over the years of shepherding an increasingly unmarriageable niece through the treacherous waters of London society, and Margaret knew she must compose herself before facing the questions that would surely come, the gentle probing about the package that had arrived with such ceremony, only to leave such devastation in its wake. She rose on unsteady legs, her blue morning dress now wrinkled from hours of sitting in dejected stillness, and moved to the writing desk, where she carefully placed the bundle of letters in the drawer that had once held her hopes for the future, then closed it with a finality that echoed through her heart like the closing of a tomb. The mirror above the mantelpiece reflected back a face she hardly recognized, pale and drawn with shadows beneath eyes that had shed no tears, for she had learned long ago that tears changed nothing, solved nothing, only served to make one's appearance even less appealing than nature had already ordained. Lady Beatrice entered without knocking, as was her way, her silver hair perfectly arranged beneath a lace cap that had been fashionable 20 years ago, and which she refused to abandon despite Margaret's gentle suggestions, and her sharp blue eyes took in the scene with the perception of a woman who had lived through her own disappointments and recognized the signs in others. "My dear child," she said, her voice softer than usual as she approached Margaret with the careful movements of someone approaching a wounded animal. "Cook tells me you have not taken luncheon, and now we must prepare for the assembly at Lady Pemberton's this evening, though I would understand completely if you wished to send our regrets." Margaret straightened her spine, drawing on reserves of strength she had cultivated through years of being overlooked and forgotten, and managed a smile that felt like glass breaking across her face, as she met her aunt's concerned gaze with determination that surprised them both. For if she was to be pitied, she would at least face that pity with her head held high, rather than cowering at home like a mouse in its hole. "I shall attend," she said, her voice steadier than her hands, as she smoothed her wrinkled skirts and prepared to face whatever whispers and speculation awaited her in society's glittering ballrooms, where broken dreams were as common as champagne and far less refreshing. Lady Pemberton's assembly rooms glowed with the warm light of 100 candles reflecting off crystal chandeliers and gilt mirrors, the air thick with the scent of hothouse flowers and expensive perfume, as London's elite swirled through the space in a kaleidoscope of silk and jewels. And Margaret stood at the entrance in her grey silk gown that had seemed appropriate when she dressed, but now felt as dull as her spirits, her gloved hand resting lightly on her aunt's arm as they prepared to face whatever whispers and speculation awaited them within those glittering walls. The butler announced their names with the same ceremonial gravity he would have used for duchesses and princesses, though Margaret knew they barely registered in the social hierarchy of the room, just another spinster and her elderly companion come to fill the spaces between the important guests, to provide the backdrop against which the true stars of society could shine all the brighter. She had nearly convinced herself she could endure the evening with grace when the atmosphere in the room shifted like the air before a thunderstorm, conversations faltering mid-sentence as heads turned toward the entrance, where the butler's voice rang out with particular emphasis announcing the Duke of Pembroke, and Margaret felt her heart stop, then resume at double pace as Alexander Pembroke entered the assembly rooms for the first time since his return from the peninsula. He stood in the doorway like a figure from a Gothic novel, his evening dress impeccable, but somehow failing to soften the hard edges that war had carved into his bearing. His dark hair shorter than fashion dictated, and his face bearing a new scar that traced a thin line from his left temple to his jaw, a mark that only enhanced rather than diminished his austere beauty. His grey eyes swept the room with the calculating gaze of a military commander assessing a battlefield, passing over the eager debutantes and their scheming mammas without pause until they found her standing by the wall in her accustomed place, and something flickered across his face too quickly for her to decipher before his expression settled back into the marble stillness that had earned him his reputation for aloofness. The room seemed to hold its breath as he moved through the crowd with purposeful strides, ignoring the attempts at conversation from those who sought to catch his attention. His gaze never leaving Margaret's face as she stood frozen like a deer sensing danger, her mind screaming at her to flee, while her body remained treacherously still, held in place by those grey eyes that had once looked at her with such warmth and now burned with an intensity she could not name. Lady Pemberton fluttered toward him with the determination of a hostess who sensed drama unfolding in her carefully orchestrated evening, but he sidestepped her with a murmured pleasantry that left her gaping as he continued his incorrigible progress toward the corner where Margaret waited with her heart thundering so loudly she was certain everyone in the room must hear it, her grey silk gown suddenly feeling like armour made of paper against whatever was about to unfold. The Duke of Pembroke stopped directly before her, close enough that she could smell the subtle blend of sandalwood and leather that clung to him like a memory, and Margaret found herself trapped between the solid wall at her back and the imposing presence of the man who had just that morning returned every letter she had written to him over 2 long years of war and separation, the weight of that rejection pressing against her chest like a physical thing, even as she forced herself to meet his gaze, with what dignity she could muster in her grey silk gown that suddenly felt as insubstantial as cobwebs. "Miss Ashworth," he said, his voice deeper than she remembered, roughened perhaps by battlefield commands or simply by whatever experiences had carved that new scar across his face, and she noticed the way his jaw tightened as he spoke her name, as if it cost him something to form the words. "Your Grace," she replied, dropping into a curtsy that was perfectly correct in its execution, even as her knees trembled beneath her skirts, aware of the dozens of eyes upon them, the conversations that had resumed in hushed tones all around them as society watched this unexpected drama unfold between the aloof duke and the forgotten spinster. He extended his hand to help her rise, and she had no choice but to take it or appear churlish, feeling the warmth of his fingers through both their gloves, a warmth that sent an unwelcome flutter through her stomach as memories of another evening flooded back, of the last time he had taken her hand at a ball before riding off to war with promises she now knew meant nothing. "I must speak with you," he said, his words low and urgent. Meant only for her ears, though she was certain the nearest gossips were straining to catch every syllable. And there was something in his eyes that she could not read, an intensity that seemed at odds with a man who had just that morning demonstrated his complete indifference to her existence by returning 2 years' worth of correspondence unopened and unread. "I believe you have said quite enough, Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady despite the churning in her stomach. "Or rather, you have said nothing at all, which I suppose amounts to the same thing when one returns 47 letters without the courtesy of breaking a single seal." His fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on hers before he released her hand, and she saw something flash across his face that might have been pain, or might have been anger, or might have been something else entirely. But before she could decipher it, he leaned closer, his breath stirring the carefully arranged curls at her temple as he whispered, "You understand nothing of why those letters were returned, Miss Ashworth. Nothing of what it cost me to send them back, and I find I can no longer bear your ignorance on this matter. So I ask you, no, I beg you, grant me a private audience tomorrow morning so that I might explain what those letters truly mean to me." The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of the Ashworth drawing-room as Margaret sat in her usual chair by the window, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling, while she waited for the Duke of Pembroke to arrive for the private audience she had granted him against her better judgment, the memory of his urgent whisper at the assembly still echoing in her ears, alongside the skeptical warnings of her aunt, who had spent breakfast reminding her that men who returned letters unopened rarely had honourable explanations for such behaviour. The clock on the mantel chimed the hour of 11, each note seeming to stretch impossibly long, as Margaret wondered if he would even appear, or if this was merely another cruel twist in whatever game he was playing with her already battered heart, when the sound of a carriage drawing up outside made her spine straighten and her breath catch in her throat. The butler announced his grace with formal precision, and Alexander entered carrying a polished wooden box that he held with both hands as if it contained something precious or perhaps dangerous, his morning coat impeccable, but his face showing signs of a sleepless night. Those grey eyes that had haunted her dreams, finding hers immediately with an intensity that made her grateful she was already seated. "Thank you for seeing me," he said, his voice carefully controlled as he stood before her, still holding the mysterious box, and Margaret noticed how his fingers gripped the edges as if he feared it might slip from his grasp, or perhaps as if he feared what would happen when he set it down and no longer had anything to occupy his hands. "I could hardly refuse after your rather dramatic request last evening, Your Grace," she replied, pleased that her voice remained steady despite the way her heart was racing, "though I confess I cannot imagine what you could possibly say that would explain or excuse the return of 2 years' worth of correspondence without so much as breaking a seal to see what news they might contain from someone you claimed to consider a friend." He moved closer, setting the box carefully on the small table beside her chair, and she could not help but notice the way his hands lingered on the smooth wood before he straightened and met her gaze. Something raw and vulnerable flickering in his expression that was so at odds with the controlled soldier who had walked into Lady Pemberton's assembly the night before. "Miss Ashworth," he began, then stopped, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that spoke of frustration and something deeper. "Margaret, if I may, what you received yesterday morning was not what you believed it to be, not a rejection or a dismissal of your friendship, but rather—" and here he paused, gesturing toward the box with a hand that she noticed trembled slightly. "The only way I could think to deliver these to you, responses I have written to every single letter you sent me during my time away, all 47 of them, sealed and waiting for you to read them as I have read yours, over and over until I could recite them from memory." Margaret stared at the wooden box as if it might transform into something else entirely, her mind struggling to comprehend what Alexander had just told her while he stood there before her with an expression of such raw vulnerability that it made her chest tighten with an emotion she dared not name. And when she finally found her voice, it came out as barely more than a whisper. "You wrote responses to all of them?" He moved to sit in the chair across from her, a liberty he had not taken before, but which seemed necessary now, as his legs appeared unsteady, and she watched as he reached for the teacup she had poured earlier, with a hand that trembled visibly, the delicate china rattling against the saucer as he lifted it. And that was when she noticed properly, for the first time, the way his right hand seemed to curl differently than his left, the fingers not quite closing naturally around the cup's handle. "Every single one," he confirmed, setting the cup down without drinking, his grey eyes never leaving her face as if memorizing every flicker of emotion that crossed it. "Though I must explain, Margaret, why they were written when they were written, and why I could not simply send them to you as any reasonable man would have done." The morning light caught the edge of a scar that ran along his right hand from knuckle to wrist, partially hidden by his cuff, but visible enough to make her breath catch as understanding began to dawn. And he must have seen her notice because he slowly extended that hand between them, palm up, allowing her to see the full extent of the damage that war had wrought upon him. "Shrapnel," he said simply, though the single word carried the weight of untold suffering. "At Quatre Bras, 2 days before Waterloo, it tore through my sword hand and left me unable to hold a pen for months, unable to write even my own name, let alone the responses your beautiful letters deserved." Margaret found herself reaching across the space between them before she could think better of it, her fingers hovering just above his scarred palm, as if afraid that touching him might cause pain, and she felt tears prick at her eyes as she imagined him lying in some field hospital, receiving her letters but unable to reply, trapped in his own body while she had assumed the worst of his silence. "The surgeon said I would never write again," he continued, his voice steady, despite the way his jaw clenched at the memory. "Said I was lucky to keep the hand at all, but I could not accept that, not when I had your letters arriving week after week, each one a lifeline I could hold but not answer, each one a torture because I could not tell you that I treasured every word, that I read them until the paper grew soft with handling, that they were the only thing that made me fight to heal." The tremor in his hand seemed to worsen as emotion overtook him, and Margaret finally let her fingers settle gently over his, feeling the raised ridges of scar tissue beneath her touch while he turned his hand to, carefully, so carefully, close his damaged fingers around hers, the gesture speaking of months of painful rehabilitation and fierce determination to regain what had been lost. All so he could hold a pen again. All so he could write back to her. The warmth of his scarred hand beneath hers seemed to anchor Margaret to this moment of revelation, as Alexander drew a shaking breath and continued his explanation, his grey eyes dark with remembered pain as he spoke of those first terrible weeks in the field hospital when her letters had arrived like clockwork every Tuesday, carried by military dispatch to wherever his regiment was stationed, and how he had made his Batman read them aloud to him over and over until the poor man could recite them as well as Alexander could. Though hearing them in another's voice had been its own form of torture, when what he wanted was to trace each word with his own fingers and compose replies that might convey even a fraction of what her correspondence meant to him. "You must understand," he said, his voice rough with emotion as his fingers tightened carefully around hers, mindful of his limited strength, but desperate to maintain this connection. When the surgeons told me I would never regain full use of my hand, when they spoke of amputation as if it were a foregone conclusion, I made a decision that I see now caused you pain, though it was never my intention, for I instructed Thomas, my secretary, to return all your letters to you unopened, rather than have him read them to me when I could not answer them, when I could not tell you how your words about the changing seasons in Hyde Park made me long for home, or how your observations about your aunt's gardening efforts made me laugh despite the pain, or how your confession in letter 23 about feeling invisible at social gatherings made me want to race back to London and stand beside you at every tedious ball and soiree until all of society saw what I saw, which was a woman of remarkable intelligence and warmth who deserved so much more than the careless dismissal of fools who could not recognize true worth when it stood before them in a modest muslin gown. Margaret felt tears slip down her cheeks as he reached with his free hand toward the wooden box, lifting the lid to reveal neat stacks of sealed letters, each one dated in handwriting that showed the progression of his recovery from barely legible scratches to the firm, clear hand of a man who had fought through months of agonizing exercises and rehabilitation. And she could see now that the first several were dated months after her original letters, written when he had finally regained enough mobility to hold a pen, though the script wavered and spoke of determination wrestling with physical limitation. I could not bear to read them knowing I might never write again, he said simply, and in those words she heard echoes of the pride that had made him return them rather than accept what he saw as an unequal exchange. But once I could hold a pen, once I knew I would be able to answer you properly, I had Thomas read them all to me in order, and I wrote my responses as if no time had passed, as if you might receive them the week after you had sent yours, because in my heart that is what I wished could happen, that somehow time might fold in on itself and erase those months of silence that must have hurt you so deeply, though I swear to you, Margaret, that every day of that silence I thought of you and fought to heal so that I might have this chance to explain, to show you that your words were never unwanted, never unvalued, but rather so precious that I could not bear to receive them without being able to give you the responses you deserved. The late morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting golden rectangles of light across the Ashworth drawing-room floor as Margaret found herself still processing the magnitude of what Alexander had revealed, her hand remaining in his as if breaking contact might shatter this fragile moment of truth between them. And when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a tentative hope that made her heart constrict with an emotion she had thought lost forever when those 47 letters had arrived at her door unopened. "Margaret," he said, and the way he spoke her name, without title or formality, sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cool April morning. "I know I have no right to ask this after the pain my silence must have caused you, but I wonder if you might consider reading them with me, your letters and my responses together, as they were meant to be read, as a conversation delayed by circumstance, but not diminished by time." The request hung in the air between them like morning mist, delicate and ephemeral, and Margaret found herself nodding before she could fully consider what such an intimate act might mean, sharing words she had written in solitude with the very man who had inspired them. But something in his eyes, a vulnerability that the proud Duke of Pembroke had never before shown to anyone, made refusal impossible. He rose carefully from his chair, still favoring his right hand, and moved to sit beside her on the settee. The proper distance between them somehow both too much and not enough, as he reached into the wooden box and withdrew 2 letters, one bearing her familiar script and one showing his painstaking hand, and Margaret felt her breath catch as she recognized her own first letter, written that night after he had left for the peninsula, when hope had still been fresh and untainted by months of silence. "Shall we begin at the beginning?" he asked softly, and there was something almost reverent in the way he handled the papers, as if they were sacred texts rather than simple correspondence. And Margaret found herself shifting slightly closer to him on the settee, drawn by some invisible force until their shoulders nearly touched, the warmth of his presence beside her both thrilling and terrifying in its intensity. "This first one," she said, her voice barely above a whisper as she looked at her own handwriting from 2 years past. "I wrote it the night after your farewell ball, when you had danced with me despite my mother's obvious disapproval, despite the whispers that followed us around the floor, and you had said something about letters being windows to the soul that made me brave enough to write to you at all." His fingers brushed hers as he positioned his response beside her original letter, and she could see how the dates aligned in his mind, if not in reality, his reply written as if he had received her letter fresh, as if those long months of silence had never existed. And when he began to read his response aloud, his voice low and intimate in the quiet morning room, Margaret felt tears gather fresh in her eyes at the words he had fought so hard to write. Words that spoke of how her letter had been the first thing to make him smile after weeks of battlefield horror, how her descriptions of London life had given him something to hold on to when pain had threatened to consume him entirely. The April afternoon in Hyde Park held all the promise of spring fulfilled, with cherry blossoms drifting like pink snow across the carriage paths and the scent of early roses perfuming the air as Margaret walked beside Alexander, her lavender pelisse a soft contrast to his dark coat, and she could not help but notice how different this public promenade felt from all the others she had taken in her 28 years, for now she was not invisible, not overlooked, but rather the subject of intense scrutiny from every passing carriage and cluster of pedestrians who recognized the Duke of Pembroke escorting the Ashworth spinster with a devotion that was impossible to misinterpret. They had spent the past 4 days sequestered in her aunt's drawing room, reading their way through years of correspondence, and with each shared letter, with each revelation of how her words had sustained him through the darkest nights of pain, and how his responses revealed a depth of feeling she had never dared imagine, Margaret felt herself falling into something that transcended her girlish infatuation of 2 years past, something real and profound that made her chest tight with emotions she could barely name. "They are all staring," she murmured as they passed the Serpentine, where several fashionable ladies had actually stopped their conversation to watch them pass, fans fluttering with barely concealed excitement at this unexpected development. And Alexander's response was to draw her hand more firmly through his arm, a gesture of possession and protection that sent warmth spiraling through her despite the cool spring breeze. "Let them stare," he said, his voice carrying that new softness she had discovered during their hours of shared reading, though beneath it remained the steel of a man who had faced down French cavalry and would not be intimidated by London gossips. "For I find I no longer care what society thinks when I have spent 2 years caring far too much about what kept me from you, and besides, I rather think they should see that the woman they dismissed as unmarriageable has captured the attention of a duke, though in truth it is I who should be grateful for your attention, Margaret, for your letters revealed a mind and heart that any man of sense would treasure above all the celebrated beauties in London." The gravel path crunched beneath their feet as they turned toward the rose garden, and Margaret felt her cheeks warm at his words, even as she noticed how he had begun to use her name without hesitation, each utterance a small rebellion against the formal distance that society demanded. And when they paused beside a bed of early damask roses, their pink blooms echoing the color in her cheeks, he turned to face her fully, his gray eyes serious as he said, "I have been thinking about letter 37, the one where you wrote about feeling like a ghost at your cousin's wedding, watching joy that seemed forever beyond your reach, and I need you to know that my response, though written months too late, meant every word about how you deserve to be the bride not the eternal observer. And Margaret, I find myself hoping, perhaps presumptuously, that our correspondence might continue beyond these letters written in separation, that we might write a new chapter together, one where neither of us needs to wonder if our words will find a receptive heart. The candelabras in Lady Montague's music room cast dancing shadows across the assembled guests, as Margaret took her seat at the pianoforte, her fingers trembling slightly as they found their position above the ivory keys, aware that every eye in the room had followed her progress from Alexander's side to the instrument, their whispers following her like autumn leaves rustling in her wake, and she could hear quite clearly the barely concealed shock in Mrs. Fairfax's voice as she hissed to her companion about the extraordinary sight of the Duke of Pembroke attending a musicale at all, much less arriving with the Ashworth spinster on his arm, as if she were someone of consequence rather than the perpetual wallflower they had all grown accustomed to ignoring these many years past. The Mozart sonata she had chosen was one she could play from memory, her fingers finding the familiar passages even as her mind registered the unusual weight of actual attention. For in all her years of providing musical entertainment at such gatherings, she had grown accustomed to being background decoration, her competent playing merely pleasant noise beneath the more important business of gossip and flirtation, but tonight she could feel the speculation crackling through the room like electricity before a storm, particularly when Alexander positioned himself where he could watch her face rather than standing with the other gentlemen near the card tables, as would have been proper. The first notes rang out clear and true despite her nervousness, and as the melody unfolded, Margaret found herself drawing strength from the music itself, from the years of practice that had filled empty hours when other young ladies were dancing and flirting and securing their futures, and she allowed herself to play as she did when alone, pouring all the emotion she had learned to hide into the rise and fall of Mozart's sublime phrases, unaware that her face had transformed with the passion of the performance, until she heard a sharp intake of breath from somewhere near the window where the younger ladies clustered like bright birds. It was during the delicate passage of the second movement that she heard it clearly, Lady Crawford's distinctive voice cutting through the music with deliberate cruelty, as she remarked to her daughter that it was quite extraordinary what lengths some women would go to in their desperation, latching on to the first gentleman to show them any attention, even if that attention was merely pity for a spinster's obvious infatuation. And Margaret felt her fingers falter for just an instant before muscle memory carried her through. But in that moment of wavering she heard something else entirely, the clear, cold voice of the Duke of Pembroke, cutting through the whispers like a blade through silk as he said with perfect clarity, "I find it extraordinary, Lady Crawford, that some people mistake profound admiration for pity, though I suppose those incapable of recognizing genuine worth in others must content themselves with such misinterpretations, for certainly anyone with eyes to see and ears to hear would recognize that Miss Ashworth possesses accomplishments that would ornament any drawing room in England, though I confess I am selfishly glad that society's blindness has left such a treasure unappreciated until now." And the silence that followed his words was so complete that the final notes of Margaret's sonata seemed to hang in the air like a benediction. The morning sun of the last day of April transformed the Ashworth garden into a paradise of colour and fragrance, with the ancient apple trees wearing crowns of white blossoms that drifted down like benedictions, while the rose bushes showed their first tentative blooms in shades of pink and cream. And Margaret sat on the worn stone bench beneath the arbour, where honeysuckle was just beginning to twine, the wooden box containing their correspondence open beside her as she and Alexander approached the final letters of their shared reading, aware with a bittersweet pang that they had only 3 more sets to explore before this excuse for daily meetings would conclude, though what would come after she dared not assume, despite the tenderness that had grown between them with each revealed word. The letter in her hands trembled slightly as she recognized her own handwriting from the previous Christmas, remembering how she had written it while the household celebrated below, and she had retreated to her chamber, pouring out her fears that she would grow old having never known what it felt like to be cherished, to be someone's first thought upon waking rather than an afterthought at social gatherings. And she hesitated before reading aloud, knowing Alexander's reply waited in his hands, but he touched her wrist gently and said, "Read it, Margaret, for I have waited months to share my response with you." His voice carrying that particular roughness she had learned meant he was fighting strong emotion. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she read her confession of loneliness, of watching her cousins marry and have children while she remained the eternal aunt and companion, useful but never essential, loved in a distant way but never with the fierce devotion she witnessed between couples who had found their match. And when she finished, the garden seemed to hold its breath as Alexander unfolded his reply with hands that showed only the slightest tremor now, a vast improvement from 2 weeks ago, and began to read in that deep voice that seemed to reach into her very soul. "My dearest Margaret, you write of being unloved, and I must tell you that you are wrong, so profoundly wrong that I would travel 1,000 miles to convince you of this truth, for you have been loved with a devotion that borders on madness by a man too proud and too wounded to declare himself, a man who has carried your letters into battle and read them by candlelight in field hospitals, who has traced your handwriting when pain made sleep impossible, and found in your words the only peace he has known in 2 years of darkness." The apple blossoms continued their gentle fall as he read on, his reply revealing how each of her letters had become more precious than any military dispatch, how he had memorized passages that sustained him through fevered nights when his hand throbbed with agony and infection, threatened to claim more than just his ability to hold a pen, how her descriptions of ordinary London life had become his talisman against the horror of war, and Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks as she understood at last that what she had taken for indifference had been its very opposite, that he had loved her through ink and paper when flesh and blood were impossible, that every unopened letter had been an act of preservation against the possibility that he might never be able to answer them properly. The first drops of rain began to fall, just as Alexander finished reading his reply, the gentle patter on the apple blossoms above them creating a soft percussion that seemed to underscore the charged silence between them, and Margaret found she could not speak, could not move, could barely breathe for the weight of emotion pressing against her ribs as she understood that this man beside her on the worn stone bench had loved her not in spite of her letters but because of them, had found in her ordinary observations and lonely confessions something worth preserving even when his own body betrayed him. And she watched through tear-blurred vision as he carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the box before turning to face her fully, his eyes holding depths of feeling that 2 weeks of daily meetings had only begun to reveal. The rain increased from a gentle misting to proper drops that began to penetrate the canopy of blossoms and leaves above them, and Alexander stood quickly, shrugging out of his coat to hold it over her head as he said, "Come, we must find shelter before you take a chill." But Margaret remained seated for a moment longer, looking up at him as raindrops caught on his dark lashes and traced paths down his cheeks that might have been tears, or might have been rain, and she realized that they had reached the end of their excuse for these meetings, that only one set of letters remained unread, and the fear that had haunted her these past days crystallized into words as she asked, "What happens tomorrow, Alexander, when there are no more letters to share?" He lowered the coat slowly, letting the rain fall on them both as he knelt before her there in the garden with the scent of wet earth and apple blossoms surrounding them, taking her hands in his with infinite gentleness as he replied, "Then we begin writing new ones, my dearest Margaret, letters that need never be posted, because I intend to deliver every word in person, if you will allow me that privilege." And she saw in his eyes not just love, but intention, promise, a future she had never dared imagine, even in her most secret hopes. The rain was falling in earnest now, soaking through her mourning dress and his white shirt, but neither moved as he continued, "I have one more letter to share with you, one I wrote last night when I realized we were approaching the end of our correspondence, and I find I cannot wait until tomorrow to give it to you." And from his waistcoat pocket, he withdrew an envelope that bore her name in his careful script, the paper already beginning to spot with raindrops as he pressed it into her hands. And Margaret opened it with trembling fingers to find not the lengthy response she expected, but a single line that made her heart stop entirely before resuming at double pace. "My beloved Margaret, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife so that I may spend every remaining day of my life proving that you have never been unloved, only waiting for the love that was always yours?" The garden around them blurred through her tears as she looked from the letter to his face. Rain streaming down both their faces now, as nature seemed determined to wash away every pretense between them, and she whispered her answer. The first pale light of May Day had barely touched the London sky when the urgent knocking at the front door shattered the peaceful dawn, and Margaret, who had spent the night in a state of such complete happiness that sleep had eluded her entirely as she replayed Alexander's rain-soaked proposal and her breathless acceptance over and over in her mind, heard the commotion from her chamber and felt an immediate chill of premonition that something was about to threaten the joy that had seemed so perfect just hours before, when Alexander had kissed her in the garden with rainwater streaming down both their faces and promised to call on her aunt formally that very afternoon to request permission for their engagement. The sound of hurried footsteps on the stairs was followed by a soft knock on her door, and her lady's maid entered with an expression of barely concealed alarm, holding a letter that bore the unmistakable seal of the Duchess of Pembroke, Alexander's formidable mother, who had been travelling on the continent these past months, and whose absence had perhaps allowed their romance to bloom without the weight of her legendary disapproval. And Margaret took the letter with hands that trembled slightly as she broke the seal to find a summons written in imperious script that brooked no refusal. "Miss Ashworth, I have been informed of your presumptuous encouragement of my son's attentions, and I require your immediate presence at Pembroke House to discuss this unfortunate situation before irreparable damage is done to the family's reputation." Signed with a flourish that spoke of generations of unquestioned authority. Margaret read the words twice, 3 times, feeling each phrase like a cold blade cutting through the warm cocoon of happiness she had wrapped around herself. And she understood with crystalline clarity that this was the trial she had always feared would come, the moment when society would remind her of her place, of her age, of her lack of fortune and connections that made her an unsuitable match for a duke, regardless of the love that had grown between them through written words and whispered promises. Yet as she sat there in her night rail with her hair still damp from yesterday's rain and her lips still tender from Alexander's kisses, she felt something steel itself within her spine, a determination that had been forged through years of being overlooked and dismissed. And she knew that she would not retreat now, not when she had tasted what it meant to be truly loved. Rising from her bed, she called for her maid to help her dress in her best morning gown, the dove-grey silk that Alexander had once said made her eyes look like storm clouds, and as she prepared herself for what would surely be the most difficult confrontation of her life, she touched the wooden box on her dressing table that held out their correspondence, drawing strength from the physical proof of their connection, remembering Alexander's words from his letters about her quiet strength and dignity. Qualities the Duchess would soon discover were not so easily intimidated by titles and tradition, and Margaret lifted her chin as she prepared to fight for the future that had finally, impossibly become possible, knowing that true love was worth any battle. The carriage ride to Pembroke House passed in what felt like mere moments despite the distance, and Margaret found herself standing before the imposing entrance with its columns that seemed designed to remind visitors of their insignificance. The dove-grey silk of her best morning gown feeling suddenly plain against the grandeur of polished marble and gilded details that spoke of centuries of wealth and power. Yet she lifted her chin and allowed the stone-faced butler to escort her through halls lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, whose painted eyes seemed to follow her progress with disapproval, until finally she was shown into a drawing-room that could have contained her aunt's entire house, where the Duchess of Pembroke sat enthroned in a chair that might as well have been a throne for all the authority it conveyed, her silver hair perfectly arranged beneath a cap of exquisite lace, her posture rigid with the kind of dignity that had never known a moment's doubt about its place in the world. And when those cold blue eyes that were so like Alexander's, yet held none of his warmth, fixed upon Margaret, she felt the full weight of generations of breeding and privilege bearing down upon her. "So you are the creature who has ensnared my son," the Duchess said without preamble or invitation to sit, her voice carrying the kind of cutting precision that had reduced countless young ladies to tears over the decades. "A spinster of no particular fortune or connection who somehow convinced him to make a fool of himself with this absurd correspondence, though I suppose I should not be surprised that a woman of your age and circumstances would resort to such desperate measures to secure a match so far above her station." And Margaret felt each word land like a physical blow, but remained standing straight. Her hands clasped calmly before her, though her heart raced with the kind of fear that comes from facing one's deepest insecurities made manifest. "Your Grace," Margaret began, her voice steadier than she had dared hope, "I have never sought to ensnare anyone, least of all your son, and if you have read any of the letters that passed between us, you would know that I wrote to him as a friend, expecting nothing in return, certainly not anticipating that he would." But the Duchess cut her off with a sharp gesture, rising from her chair with the kind of fluid grace that spoke of dancing masters and deportment lessons from childhood, moving to stand before Margaret with the full advantage of her height and presence. "Do not presume to tell me what I would know, Miss Ashworth, for I know exactly what kind of woman writes to a man for 2 years without encouragement, what kind of calculating patience it takes to wait for a vulnerable moment to press one's advantage. And I am here to tell you that whatever promises my son may have made in a moment of weakness, they will not be honored, for I will not allow the Pembroke name to be degraded by association with someone who brings nothing to the union but her own desperation." And Margaret felt something shift within her, not the crushing defeat the Duchess clearly expected, but rather a strange calm that came from recognizing that she had already survived her greatest fear of being deemed unworthy, had lived with that pronouncement from society for years, and found that it held less power over her now than the memory of Alexander's love. Margaret had barely slept after her confrontation with the Duchess, returning home in a state of numb shock that had given way to a restless night of replaying every cutting word, every dismissive glance. Yet when morning light filtered through her chamber windows on the 2nd of May, she rose with a strange sense of peace, knowing she had faced her greatest fear and survived it, had stood before the embodiment of everything society said she could never be, and found herself still standing, still breathing, still loving Alexander with a certainty that no amount of ducal disapproval could shake, though she dressed carefully in her blue morning dress, the same one she had worn that April morning when his letters had been returned, as if completing some circle of fate that had begun with apparent rejection and would end however it must end, with her dignity intact regardless of the outcome. She had just finished breaking her fast, managing only tea and a piece of toast that sat heavy in her stomach, when she heard the sound of a carriage arriving with unusual haste, the horse's hooves clattering on the cobblestones with an urgency that made her aunt look up from her correspondence with raised eyebrows. And before the butler could even announce the visitor, Alexander burst through the drawing-room doors with an expression of such fierce determination that Margaret's breath caught in her throat, his appearance dishevelled as if he had dressed hastily, his cravat askew and his dark hair falling across his forehead in a way that made him look younger, more vulnerable, yet paradoxically more commanding than she had ever seen him. "Margaret," he said, crossing to her in 3 swift strides and taking both her hands in his before she could even rise from her chair, his grip almost painful in its intensity. "Thomas told me everything, how my mother summoned you yesterday, what she said to you, and I am here to tell you that she had no right, no authority to speak for me or to presume what I will or will not do with my life, my choices, my heart." And his voice carried a roughness that spoke of his own sleepless night, of arguments fought and positions declared, of a man who had finally reached the point where love mattered more than duty. Behind him, Margaret became aware of Thomas Sinclair, hovering in the doorway with an expression of barely concealed satisfaction, and beyond him she could see servants gathering, drawn by the unprecedented drama of their mistress receiving a duke who had arrived without proper notice or ceremony, creating the kind of scene that would be whispered about in drawing-rooms across London by tea-time. Yet Alexander seemed oblivious to their audience as he pulled her to her feet, his hands still holding hers, as if he feared she might disappear if he let go. "Your mother made her position quite clear," Margaret began, but Alexander shook his head sharply, a gesture so unlike his usual controlled manner that it spoke volumes about his emotional state, and his next words came in a rush that revealed how much he had prepared to say, how much he needed her to understand. "My mother's position is not mine, has never been mine, and if I allowed her fears and prejudices to dictate my choices, then I would be no better than those who dismissed you as a spinster, who overlooked your worth because of arbitrary rules about age and fortune and connections, when the truth that our letters revealed is that you are the only woman who has ever truly seen me, known me, understood the man beneath the title." And as he spoke, Margaret felt the walls she had built around her heart to protect against disappointment beginning to crumble. "Alexander?" she whispered, aware of their audience, of the impropriety of this scene, yet unable to care about anything beyond the desperate hope in his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly where they held hers. And he must have sensed her weakening resolve, because he pressed on, his voice growing stronger, more certain. "Do you remember what I wrote in my final letter, the one we read together in the garden before the rain came, about how your words had become my anchor during the darkest days of war, how knowing someone saw me as more than a title or a uniform had given me reason to survive, to heal, to come home?" And Margaret nodded, tears gathering in her eyes as she remembered that letter, the most beautiful and vulnerable of all his responses, where he had laid bare his soul in words that had made her weep with their honesty. "Then you must know," he continued, his voice dropping to an intimate register that made their witnesses fade into irrelevance, "that I cannot, will not choose a life without you in it, regardless of what society says, what my mother threatens, what the gossips whisper, because you, Margaret Ashworth, have become essential to my very existence in a way that defies all rational explanation." And before she could respond, he did something that would be talked about for years to come, something so unprecedented that even Thomas Sinclair gasped. The Duke of Pembroke dropped to one knee in the middle of her modest drawing-room, still holding her hands, his eyes never leaving hers as he spoke the words that would change everything. I asked you once before in the rain, but I ask you again now, in full view of the world, with complete understanding of what it means. Will you marry me? Not because I am a duke or you are a spinster, but because we are two souls who found each other through words on a page and discovered that love can bloom in the most unexpected places. The morning of May 15th dawned with the kind of perfect spring weather that poets write about and brides pray for, sunlight streaming through gauze curtains to wake Margaret earlier than her maid had planned, though she had barely slept anyway, her mind too full of wonder at the transformation her life had undergone in just 2 weeks, from rejected spinster to the soon-to-be Duchess of Pembroke, a title that still felt foreign on her tongue, even as she rose to begin preparations for what society had deemed impossible, her wedding day arriving with all the sweet certainty of answered prayers and defied expectations. And as her maid helped her into the cream silk gown that had been rushed to completion by the most exclusive modiste in London, a woman who had nearly fainted when the Duke himself had accompanied Margaret to the fitting, insisting on the finest fabrics and most delicate lace, Margaret caught sight of herself in the looking-glass and barely recognized the woman staring back, her cheeks flushed with happiness rather than embarrassment, her eyes bright with anticipation rather than resignation, looking every inch a bride despite her 28 years that society had deemed too many, and she thought of all the mornings she had dressed carefully, only to face another day of invisibility, all the assemblies where she had been overlooked, all the whispers about poor Miss Ashworth and her unfortunate circumstance, only to arrive at this moment where none of that mattered anymore because Alexander had seen her, truly seen her, had read her heart in 47 letters and responded with his own, choosing love over duty, choosing her over his mother's objections and society's expectations. And as her aunt appeared in the doorway, tears boughs already gathering in her eyes at the sight of her transformed niece, Margaret felt the full weight of the miracle that had occurred, that love had indeed found a way through the most unlikely of circumstances, through unopened letters and wounded hands, through social prejudice and maternal disapproval, to bring them to this moment where she would walk down the aisle of St. George's not as a desperate spinster grasping at her last chance, but as a woman fully seen, fully known, fully loved. And when the carriage arrived to take her to the church, when she saw the small crowd that had gathered despite the early hour and intimate nature of the ceremony, she understood that their story had captured something beyond mere gossip, had become a testament to the possibility that love could bloom in the most unexpected places, that happy endings could come to those who society had written off. And as she entered the church on her aunt's arm, the space filled with only their closest friends and the servants who had watched their romance unfold, her eyes found Alexander waiting at the altar, his face transformed by a smile of such pure joy that her heart nearly stopped. And in that moment, she knew that every letter written, every word shared, every moment of doubt and pain had led them here, to this perfect morning where the spinster and the Duke would become simply Margaret and Alexander, bound together by far more than vows, bound by letters that had revealed two souls meant to find each other, despite every obstacle the world had placed in their path. The wedding breakfast at Ashworth House on the morning of May 16th bore little resemblance to the grand affairs typically associated with ducal marriages. Yet Margaret thought she had never seen a more perfect celebration as she entered the dining room on Alexander's arm to find it transformed with spring flowers and morning light, the intimate gathering of perhaps 20 guests rising to applaud their entrance with genuine warmth that brought tears to her eyes, for these were the people who had truly supported them, who had seen past society's conventions to celebrate love's victory. And as they took their seats at the head of the table, she marveled at how different everything felt from just a month ago when she had been merely invisible Miss Ashworth, overlooked at every gathering, and now here she sat as the new Duchess of Pembroke, though the title mattered far less than the man whose hand covered hers on the table, whose eyes kept finding hers with a wonder that matched her own. And as the toasts began, each one revealed another layer of support she had never known existed. Starting with Thomas Sinclair, who rose first, his usually reserved demeanor giving way to obvious emotion as he raised his glass and spoke of watching his friend and employer transform from a man hollowed out by war to one renewed by love, how he had been privy to those long nights when Alexander had painstakingly written his responses despite his still healing hand, determined to answer every word Margaret had sent him. And then Lady Beatrice stood, her voice wavering as she spoke of the niece she had watched bloom from overlooked wallflower to radiant bride, how she had prayed for exactly this miracle, even when it seemed impossible, and one by one others rose to share their stories. The modiste, who confessed she had been moved to tears by the Duke's tender attention to Margaret during the fitting. The hostess of the musicale, who admitted she had deliberately arranged the seating to push them together. The elderly Lord Fairfax, who had served with Alexander's father, and saw in this marriage a worthy continuation of the family honour. Each revelation building a picture of a community that had been quietly rooting for love to find a way. And when the butler brought in an enormous wooden crate that required 2 footmen to carry, Alexander's face lit up with boyish delight as he encouraged Margaret to open it, revealing inside the most exquisite writing desk she had ever seen, crafted from rosewood with mother-of-pearl inlay, dozens of small drawers and compartments for storing letters, and a silver plate engraved with both their initials intertwined, a gift that drew gasps from the assembled guests, but meant even more to Margaret for what it represented. Alexander's understanding that their letter-writing had not ended with marriage, but would continue as part of their daily life together, and as she ran her fingers over the smooth surface, imagining all the letters they would write side by side at this desk, she felt the last piece of her transformation click into place. No longer the spinster writing lonely letters into the void, but a beloved wife, whose words would always find their intended reader, whose thoughts would always be treasured, whose love had been proven stronger than every obstacle society had placed in its path. The afternoon sun of May 1816 streamed through the tall windows of Pembroke House's grand ballroom, illuminating a scene that would have been unimaginable just 1 year ago as Margaret, now the Duchess of Pembroke, moved gracefully among the assembled guests at the charity event she had organized for war widows and orphans, her hand resting protectively over the gentle swell beneath her blue silk gown where their first child grew. A visible symbol of the complete transformation her life had undergone, and as she paused to speak with each guest, ensuring everyone felt welcomed and valued regardless of their station, she caught glimpses of Alexander across the room, his eyes following her with the same wonder and devotion that had marked every day of their marriage, the same look that still made her heart skip when she woke beside him each morning. And Lady Beatrice, seated near the refreshment table and holding court with several other elderly ladies, beamed with pride at her niece, who had become one of the most beloved duchesses in London society, not through grand gestures or ostentatious displays, but through the same quiet kindness and genuine warmth that had always defined her character, qualities that society had once overlooked, but now celebrated. And Margaret smiled as she noticed Mrs. Morrison, the head housekeeper, discreetly wiping tears as she watched her mistress comfort a young widow, remembering perhaps how this same duchess had once been dismissed as a hopeless spinster. And the transformation extended beyond just Margaret herself, for Alexander too had changed, the shadows that had haunted him upon his return from war gradually lifting under the influence of their daily letter exchanges, a practice they had maintained even after marriage, sitting together each evening at the beautiful rosewood desk to share their thoughts and dreams on paper as they had during their courtship. And as Margaret moved to greet the Duchess of Worthington, who had become an unexpected ally after witnessing Margaret's dignity in the face of her mother-in-law's initial opposition. She reflected on how wrong society had been about so many things, about the value of a woman past her supposed prime, about the possibility of love blooming from the most unlikely circumstances, about the power of words written from the heart to bridge any distance. And when a young woman approached hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable in such grand surroundings, Margaret immediately recognized the look of someone who felt invisible in a crowded room, the same expression she had worn for so many years, and she took the girl's hand warmly, drawing her into conversation and learning that she too was considered past marriageable age at 26, had been told too many times that her chances were gone, and Margaret felt Alexander's presence beside her before his hand touched her back, both of them understanding without words what needed to be said. And together they spent the next half hour with the young woman, sharing just enough of their own story to plant seeds of hope, to suggest that sometimes the very things society deemed impossible were merely waiting for the right moment to bloom into reality. And as the afternoon wore on, Margaret felt the baby move within her, a flutter of new life that seemed to punctuate the complete circle her journey had taken, from lonely spinster writing letters into the void, to cherished wife and soon-to-be mother, surrounded by love and purpose, proof that happy endings were not reserved only for the young and conventionally beautiful, but could come to anyone brave enough to keep hoping, to keep writing their truth, to keep believing that somewhere, someone would read their words and understand their heart completely. That evening, as the last guests departed from the charity event and the grand ballroom fell quiet, save for the servants beginning to clear away the remnants of the celebration, Margaret found herself in the private study she shared with Alexander, seated at the rosewood desk that had become the heart of their daily ritual, the lamplight casting a warm glow over the blank pages before her as she dipped her pen in ink and began to write. Not to some distant correspondent this time, but directly to you, dear listener, who have followed this journey from its darkest moments to its brightest triumph. For she understood now that every story of love found against the odds carries within it a message for those still waiting, still hoping, still wondering if their time will ever come. And as Alexander entered the room, moving quietly despite his size, coming to stand behind her chair and rest his hands gently on her shoulders, she felt the familiar comfort of his presence, the man who had taught her that love letters need not go unanswered, that patience and faith could transform even the most hopeless situation into something beautiful beyond imagining. And together they sat in companionable silence as she continued writing, sharing with you the truth she had learned through those long months of uncertainty and revelation, that sometimes what appears to be rejection is actually the deepest form of devotion, that the person who seems unreachable may be fighting battles you cannot see to make themselves worthy of your affection, that age and convention and society's narrow definitions of value mean nothing when two hearts recognize each other across a crowded room or through words written on a page. And as she felt the baby move again within her, a reminder of all the new life and possibility their love had created, she wanted you to know that your own stack of metaphorical unopened letters, whatever form they might take, whether actual correspondence or dreams deferred or hopes that seem foolish to others, all of these deserve to be honored and held sacred. For you never know when someone might arrive at your door with their own box of carefully crafted responses, having taken the time to answer every single word you thought had fallen on deaf ears, and if a spinster of 28, deemed past all hope of marriage, could become a duchess not through manipulation or compromise, but through the simple act of being seen and valued for exactly who she was, then surely there is hope for every heart that has ever felt invisible, overlooked, or dismissed as too old, too plain, to anything that the world uses to diminish our light. And as Margaret signed her name to this letter to you, adding below it a postscript that Alexander penned in his own hand, encouraging you to keep writing your truth into the world regardless of who seems to be listening, they both understood that their story was not ending, but transforming into something larger, a testament to the power of patient love and the written word to change destinies, to challenge conventions, and to remind us all that it is never, ever too late for your own happily ever after to begin. And if their tale has touched your heart, dear listener, then perhaps you might consider joining their circle of correspondence, subscribing to hear more stories of love's triumph over adversity. For in sharing these tales, we create a community of believers, each one holding space for another's impossible dream to come magnificently true.